Good morning and welcome to the 11th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Agenda item 1 is decision on taking business in private. I am assuming that everyone agrees unless a member indicates otherwise. So does any member object to taking items 5, 6 and 7 in private? Only raise your hand if you object. Members have agreed to take items 5, 6 and 7 in private. Agenda item 2 is decision on taking business in private. The purpose of this item is to enable the committee to consider certain business in private, primarily relating to consideration of its work programme at future formal meetings during COVID-19 public health emergency. Does any member object to agreeing to consider the items listed in private during the COVID-19 public health emergency? Again, only raise your hand if you object. Members have agreed to take these items in response to COVID-19 governance and assurance arrangements. And can I welcome to this meeting this morning Leslie Evans, Permanent Secretary, Gordon Wales, Chief Financial Officer, Leslie Fraser, Interim Director for Organisational Development and Operations, and Shirley Rogers, Director of Organisational Readiness, all from the Scottish Government. Can I first of all thank you for your time today, and I wish you and your families are well at what is an anxious time for all of us. The committee recognises the very challenging times in which we are living and the significant pressures on many of the public bodies. However, the Auditor General has emphasised that sound financial management and effective governance are more important than ever. The committee wanted to hear from the Scottish Government today on the arrangements that have been put in place to ensure that decision-making and financial management in relation to COVID-19 are subject to robust and transparent processes. I understand that the Permanent Secretary will be making a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to provide evidence today on the Scottish Government's decision-making, governance and accountability arrangements in relation to the COVID emergency. Now, I should say at the outset, none of us witnesses here would claim to be public health specialists. So we shall certainly get back to you on any very specific technical or more detailed points you may wish to probe. COVID is undoubtedly the biggest challenge that Scotland and the civil service has experienced in our lifetime. It has demanded, and indeed will continue to demand, an unprecedented shift in how we work. We all recognise the outstanding response of NHS Scotland and care services in this crisis. And in support of this, I am proud that in a matter of weeks, the Scottish Government devised, announced and implemented radical response and reform, not just in the NHS, but in support of business, the most vulnerable in our society, and through emergency legislation. All of this has been guided by what I refer to as the Scottish Government's North Star, is the enduring focus, values and outcomes of the National Performance Framework, including drawing on lived experience and working very closely and in step with our partners across Scotland. Crucially, our response has been underpinned by the principles of good governance, leadership, accountability, integrity, effectiveness, transparency and sustainability. For example, existing corporate governance structures, emergency response structures and business continuity plans were activated. Appropriate and additional robust financial controls were put in place to scrutinise the rapid and significant decisions required. And we commissioned internal audit to work with all our accountable officers on governance and decision-taking. I'm pleased that these efforts have attracted some positive comment from the Auditor General. But operating at this scale and pace of change is not without consequences. We and our partners had to move very fast at the outset in order to help save lives, including making assessments and reaching decisions sometimes in days that might otherwise have taken weeks. Let me highlight 3 examples of our learning to date. Firstly, the importance of open and transparent reprioritisation of existing government commitments to create capacity to respond effectively to the emergency. For example, redirecting NHS resources and capacity and pausing elements of the social security programme. Secondly, our essential partnership working with COSLA, with Solace, with Police Scotland, with Fire and Rescue, academia, the military, unions business, the third sector, and many others. And thirdly, our ability to pivot. The crucial agility and professionalism shown by my extraordinary colleagues, redeployed at speed to areas of top priority and creating and adapting structures and services to operate 7 days a week. Now, once the timing is right, we shall take more formal opportunities to look back at our learning and the decisions made. And I want to ensure that Audit Scotland is able to scrutinise these as part of their work plan for 2021. Meanwhile, we focus on health, societal, organisational and especially economic renewal and capturing good practice and reform. And the forthcoming programme for government for 2021 will set out priorities in the context of this recovery phase from COVID-19, in particular the economic response, not least as we also prepare for EU exit, another significant pressure on the organisation. Convener, these are exceptionally challenging times for the Scottish Government, for the civil service and indeed Scotland, and I welcome the opportunity with my colleagues here today to discuss this.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary, and again, thank you for your time this morning. I've got a few open questions and then I'm going to hand over to Colin Beattie. Firstly, do we have existing crisis management systems and decision-making systems in place for such scenarios? And if so, have they been, I presume, instigated, and how have they worked or not worked, and how have they been developed? And if we haven't got those, didn't have those existing management systems, are we maintaining new management systems for any future crises that may come before us?
So we do have governance and decision-making systems already in place, and indeed a very firm basis of that solid foundation, I would call it, in preparation for extraordinary circumstances. I don't think any organisation or institution could ever anticipated the nature of this kind of emergency. However, we do have and have had and indeed refreshed them and tested them not that long ago, business continuity plans. We have assurance reporting and dashboard data, which we see regularly, risk registers and so on. We have governance and assurance procedures and structures, which I revised, I think, in my second year as Permanent Secretary, and which we have placed on the Scottish Government website recently, which shows the decision-making and governance and assurance structures that underpin all this. I think the important thing to mention, is firstly, our corporate governance and therefore decision-making refers to and rests on the 6 principles that I mentioned in my opening statement: leadership, accountability, integrity, and so on. But secondly, we did have to adapt our underpinning organisational governance structure to suit the circumstances and at speed, where we knew we were going to have to execute decision-making and considerations in response to such an urgent set of circumstances.
And second question is around supply chains. Clearly, how we procure has been really tested over the last few months, in no small part around ventilators, around adequate PPE. What lessons have we learnt around our supply chains and how we have our procurement structures in Scotland?
So Gordon Wales may want to say a little about procurement, but certainly if we're looking particularly at something like PPE, which has been the headline address, the NHS National Services Scotland launched bespoke online procurement portal at the very beginning of this outlet. We already knew at that point that we were going to have to look really carefully at what was an international procurement issue, in fact, not just one in Scotland, as you know. In addition, we looked very carefully at where we could start to home produce products, particularly looking at PPE, and we've had some success in that, as you may well be aware, particularly in terms of some of the ingredients that make up the protective maskwear that we use, also in terms of visions and masks. And I think the other area where we have had a local entrepreneur business helping us is to do with sanitizer up at Grangemouth. So we have been aware of trying to make sure that we put the call out through the procurement portal. I think we had over 1,000 offers of people and businesses to help us with that, but also to seek deliberately to see where businesses could repivot and strengthen the local supply chain for such important equipment. I have to say we did not get to the point where we were ever in any doubt about being able to supply PPE, but we have looked carefully and will continue to do so at how we can ensure that we learn from this process.
Thank you. Does Gordon Wills want to come back in before I hand over to Colin Beattie?
I don't think I've got anything major to add, Convener, other than to say that, of course, these have been unprecedented and indeed worldwide demands on PPE. So every organisation that uses PPE will, of course, be learning lessons from it, as will the Scottish Government, and ensuring that future procurement regimes and indeed the frameworks that support those are resilient enough to support an incident like this again in the future. And that work is underway.
Thank you, Gordon Wills. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Permanent Secretary, as you may know, in the past it's often proven difficult for parliaments to scrutinise intergovernmental discussions and regulation and negotiations. What kind of record keeping is actually being maintained in order to ensure that there's an appropriate audit trail for key discussions and decisions?
So we have, there's a number of layers to this. We have obviously an overriding responsibility to comply with the Public Records Scotland Act in taking minutes, in complying with data protection and with FOI regulations and responsibilities. We also have a leadership responsibility in all of this in terms of the record keeping of information and interactions. And we have a senior information risk owner who is with us here today. That is Leslie Fraser, who may want to speak a little bit about her role. In each divisional area, in each business area, we have a set of responsibilities where individual chairs and secretariats have a responsibility for recording decisions, minutes of meetings and so on. And at an individual level, of course, as civil servants, we're subject to the Civil Service Code, as are ministers, the equivalent ministerial codes of conduct. I think with specific reference to relationships and contact with the UK government and with other devolved administrations, most of the contact that we have had with the UK government has been being invited to meetings at their hand. So there have been ministerial group meetings very regularly. I was in a meeting 5 days a week at 5 o'clock in the early weeks of this process, joining colleagues, permanent secretary colleagues from across the UK each day. And the minutes and actions from those were taken at the UK government's hand, and we were given an opportunity to see those, of course. In addition, you'll be aware that there will be regular meetings with devolved administrations, not just through the resilience process, such as COBRA, but also through contact between direct ministerial portfolio interests. And there has been correspondence between ministers on key issues to do with Scotland's interests and devolved interest in this, and all of those have been recorded.
Just to take this a step further, specifically with HM Treasury, what ongoing arrangements are in place with HM Treasury about the levels and timing of additional funding to the Scottish Government as a result of increased UK spending on COVID-19?
There is a great deal of contact with the UK Government on that very point. We have, of course, ministerial contact of a formalised nature. There is a quadrilateral system of meetings where the finance ministers for each of the devolved administration and the UK government get together on a regular basis, minuted meetings. There is also official level contact of a regular nature. Gordon Wales may want to talk a bit about the timing and process around that. I am in regular contact with my permanent secretary colleagues and indeed with the Cabinet Secretary Sir Mark Stedwell about the pressures and strains which are being experienced, not just within the organisation, but in the policies and priorities that we are trying to implement. And there is a regular programme of reporting back at places, as you'd expect, forums such as Cabinet, about the nature of those contacts, and particularly the quadrilaterals and the requests which are being made through written requests, letters and so on, between Ms Forbes and her colleagues and counterparts in the UK government.
Can I just ask, is there absolute clarity on how much has actually been given to Scotland by HM Treasury in support of COVID-19? and where it's hypothecated to any special purpose, is there a clear understanding of that as well?
Yes, I think you'll find the summer budget report to Parliament, which I think was made last week, and again, Gordon may well want to come into the detail of this, gave an account of the level of consequentials, as we call them, that have been amassed so far to the Scottish Government and other administrations, of course, as well, to date. But this is a moving picture, as you can imagine. So we know how much we have been allocated to date, and we know that our spend on COVID has more than exceeded that amount which has come from the UK government in consequentials. I think Gordon will have the exact figures, but I think at the moment we're talking about £3.5 billion from the UK government and over £4 billion expended to date. We know we are going to have to spend considerably more than that, not just in terms of maintaining what we have set out to date in the route map, but also as we emerge from COVID and realise some of the harm and some of the damage we are going to have to focus on very clearly in the next phase of our work here. So there is clarity. I think the only other one thing to say is, of course, this can go down as well as up if the UK government decide to reprioritise the money that is that they spend across their departments that has a Barnett formula consequence. Then, of course, our consequentials can actually go down as a result of that, not up. But Gordon may wish to say something in a bit more detail about this, which you might find helpful as well.
I'd be very happy to. So first and foremost, just to go back to engagement with the Treasury, Mr. Beattie, there is daily contact. There is a daily call between Scottish Government and indeed other devolved administration officials and the Treasury, and that has largely been in place since this crisis escalated. So that provides an opportunity, of course, for the UK Government to impart what is happening at their end, in particular around spending decisions that are being made in UK departments, and of course for the devolved administrations to then ask questions, pose particular issues and seek to resolve some of those areas that are uncertain. And as the Permanent Secretary says, this is very much a moving picture. Tomorrow, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance will be appearing before the Finance Committee to give evidence on the summer budget revision, which of course is an entirely unprecedented event for us. Normally we carry out two formal budget revisions each year, the spring budget revision and the autumn budget revision. And this year we're doing a summer budget revision. And as the Permanent Secretary says, that was published last week. And as I said, the evidence session will be tomorrow. So there will be an opportunity for the Finance Committee to scrutinise that in some detail. But as the Permanent Secretary also said, it is very much a moving feast. So the spring budget revision was locked. We had to obviously set a date for when we lock those figures for the purposes of the summer budget revision. And that was locked at Barnett consequentials of £3.581 billion. The SPICE briefing that accompanies the summer budget revision evidence tomorrow actually notes that it has changed to 3.720 billion, but really as of today, that's changed again to 3.791 billion. So this is practically, although not always, moving on a daily basis. And of course, that is as a direct consequence of decisions being made by UK departments and clarification being sought by devolved administrations, including, of course, the Scottish Government.
Can I ask how the Scottish Government is going to ensure that there's absolute transparency of how the additional funds provided to local authorities, businesses and organisations in support, how that transparency is going to be put in place and how it's affected?
I might suggest that Gordon picks that up directly, Gordon.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. So, of course, as I mentioned, the summer budget revision process was published last week, and there will be the evidence session tomorrow. And the summer budget revision sets out in some significant detail both the consequentials that have been allocated by the UK departments and indeed the application of those across all ministerial portfolios. So there is a fairly comprehensive spring budget revision document that sets out in very substantial detail each part of how those consequentials are being applied, not just at portfolio level as far as Cabinet Secretary portfolios are concerned, but actually at individual areas. So you will be able to see in that document what has been applied in very specific areas, for example, for local authorities and so on. And I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary for Finance will be able to detail answers to any specific questions that the Finance Committee will have on the back of that summer budget revision tomorrow. And, you know, we recognised here that there was both parliamentary and significant public interest in both the allocation of these consequentials and indeed their application. And that's why we've taken this unprecedented step of publishing an additional budget revision process. And as I said earlier on, there will be at least two further budget revisions during the year where there will be the opportunity for both the government to set out the detail of the application of the next stage of Parliament consequentials and indeed for Parliament to be able to scrutinise those as well.
As part of this, will there be an impact and value for money assessment on basically to find out if we're spending our money in the right places and we're getting good value for it? Will that be part of it?
Oh, absolutely. So let's remember that the allocation of consequentials by the UK government does not force upon Scottish ministers the requirement to allocate those consequentials in exactly the format that they have been allocated. So Scottish ministers are free to apply those as they see fit. They have largely done so in the same proportions as UK ministers have, but there have been, as you will know, some differences in the application of grants, for example, to specific sectors. It's worth being clear that there are processes in place for all of the application of those consequentials from a value for money perspective. So decisions have been made by individual accountable officers, so senior officials within the Scottish Government, before those spending decisions were actually made. And of course, they are required to uphold the duties they have as accountable officers. So that's ensuring the regularity, propriety, and indeed the value for money of all spending decisions. Those have to be justified. And we have put additional layers of control on top of that spending. So all decisions that are COVID-19 related, that are over £1 million, have gone through a specific approvals process that it has to be developed and supported and interrogated by the accountable officer, including for value for money. And those applications are then approved by both the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and indeed the Deputy First Minister. So that's not normally a spending control that we would have in place for anything over £1 million, but we've recognised the need for that level of due diligence applied to this spending. And so we have had that in place since the outset of this crisis.
Just one last question there. What plans are in place to actually assess the impact of the pandemic on both the fiscal framework and the Scottish Government's 5-year medium-term financial strategy?
So if I might pick that up as well. So as the committee will be aware, the fiscal framework was already due for review. There was a 5-year review built in when the fiscal framework was originally published. And the process with the Treasury to begin the process of analysis and evidence gathering to determine the outcome of that review was already underway when this crisis began. And of course, we have seen that the level of pressure that's been placed on the Scottish Government's budget as a consequence of this crisis has been unprecedented. I think it's already fair to say, and indeed this had been set out in the 2020-21 budget that was published earlier this year, that Scottish ministers felt that the fiscal framework itself, before this crisis escalated, was not proving to be sufficient in order to support the Scottish Government's spending and borrowing requirements and indeed reserve demands as they were. So it is clear that a very substantial review of the fiscal framework will need to take place not just as a consequence of the work that was already in train, but specifically because of this crisis as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beattie. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I've only one brief question for the panel today, which is during a session in March, the Auditor General referred to her role as the Comptroller in authorising the drawdown of funds to government from the consolidated funds that Colin Beattie's just been exploring, and suggested that given the current exceptional circumstances, it was possible that the Scottish Government might want to break the limits of the budget. Is it possible, in your view, that the Government may need to do this?
I'll ask Gordon to come back in on the technical aspects of this, but we really have no choice but to stay within budget. That is both a responsibility and an important part of our history and achievements over the past years of devolution. We are already well engaged with ministers, and indeed from the very beginning of this process we have been looking afresh at how we prioritise our spend, where we may need to pause, where we need to reconsider or at least reframe the way in which we're carrying out our work with spend attached. And we will be looking again at this as we move and have moved from the epidemic element of COVID-19 to what I might call the endemic element of it as we move to a different phase. So we're not only having to reprioritise in terms of the money we spend and commitments we have made, and some of those have already been referred to earlier on today, but also in terms of where we place our staff and resources, so where we actually get the work done. Gordon may want to say something more about the technical elements of this, but I'm very clear that we must stay within budget, and we will need to take some tough decisions in order to be able to do that.
Convener, a few points I would wish to add. So, absolutely, the Permanent Secretary is of course correct. The Scottish Government is not entitled to breach its budget limit. It's worth saying that there are two specific limits that the Scottish Government has to adhere to. One is an overall budget limit, and one is what the Treasury calls a cash authorisation limit. And of course, the two are different things because the budget includes many non-cash items as well, such as depreciation and impairments and so on and so forth. So both of those have to be adhered to. And we did recognise in mid to late March that there was potentially, even in the 2019-20 financial year, some risks associated with the potential demands that were being placed on cash at UK level. So the Scottish Government had not drawn down fully its entire cash authorisation limit in the 2019-20 financial year. So recognising these risks, I took the decision to ensure that the Scottish Consolidated Fund was populated with the entirety of the cash authorisation limit that was available to it in 2019-20. So that when we went into the 2020-21 financial year, there was a sufficient buffer there. And that's proven to be a prudent decision because there were very significant demands on cash at UK level, as you will have seen from the borrowing that has had to be undertaken at UK level. And that's helped to provide a comfort blanket, if you will, to make sure that the cash was all in place, particularly during April and May, when those very specific cash demands were arising for the early phases of COVID-19 response. We are, of course, working to make sure that we absolutely understand the demands that are on both the budget and the cash authorisation limit for 2020-21, and we will work to ensure that the Scottish Government does not breach either of those limits. And you will see in the documentation associated with the summer budget revision that is the subject of evidence tomorrow, that we're already beginning to accrue savings, and further savings will indeed need to be accrued in order to ensure that we live within both of those limits.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. If no other questions, I'm going to hand over to Alec Neil.
Thank you, Convener. Can I follow up with the Permanent Secretary and Gordon just in the discussion we've been having? Basically, as I understand the picture from how it's been described, we have spent now, Gordon said, £3.79 billion of consequential money we've got specifically for COVID, but in addition to those consequentials having been committed, we've also got, I think the Permanent Secretary said, in pounds on top of that, which will have to be funded by the Scottish Government itself. So my first question is, where will the money come to fund that additional $500 million? Is the additional $500 million still $500 million, or since it was calculated, has that too gone up? And will the cash limit carried forward, the authorised cash limit, which Gordon has just said is put into the consolidated fund for this year, will that be enough to cover the gap between what we're getting in consequentials for COVID and what we're spending on COVID?
So, Mr. Neal, perhaps I could start off and then pass to Gordon, who is the expert on these things. I think the first thing to say is to re-emphasise that we are still within a very fast-moving environment, as you will understand. So the snapshot of the figures that, as we heard earlier on, are already moving, will move again in terms of our spend, and depending on the success of pressure and conversations that are being held between the devolved administration and the UK government, possibly some more consequentials that will be released. We don't know about that. So whilst we are in this fast-moving and intense period, we need to assume that we will have to reprioritise some of our spend to accommodate that element of COVID-related spend, which is not at the moment being covered clearly by consequentials. And we are looking at that very carefully all the time, not just as a one-off, but actually on a rolling programme of discussion. And we will be having conversations with Cabinet Secretaries over the next 2 or 3 weeks, in fact, through accountable officer conversations with each of their Cabinet Secretaries, looking at where we may need to squeeze out, consider and look at other options of how we deliver for COVID, but increasingly actually for the impact of COVID, which is the area which will be actually probably as pressing as the work that we've already done in phase 1 of just dealing with the epidemic. Now, Gordon may want to say something a bit more about that. But
just before Gordon comes in, I understand all of that, but what I'm trying to get is hold on the figures as they are today. I fully appreciate by next week, by next month, the figures will have changed. But you said, Permanent Secretary, at the moment there's about a £500 million gap, and you quoted the £3.5 billion in consequentials. That was updated by Gordon after you. He said it's now 3.791 billion. So my two questions are, what's the update on the £500 million gap? Is that now bigger? And if so, how, as of today, how much of that can be funded from the cash carried forward, as Gordon said, from last year into this year?
Yeah, and that is the work that is ongoing at the moment. I'll ask Gordon to speak about the specifics of the accrued money and how we deal with that within year. But we have to be able to resolve this within year, and at the same time, and this is something that is perhaps worth emphasising, whilst continuing to press the UK government for further flexibility in the way not just the fiscal framework operates, but other elements of our funding relationship. So there is a twin track of work here, continuing to work with Treasury officials and indeed minister-to-minister conversations about what further flexibilities might be permitted, and as well as making sure that we are looking after our own housekeeping at keeping our spending not just under control, but clearly in relation to the money that we know is coming in through consequentials. Gordon may want to say something a little bit more. The figures that he has quoted, as you say, demonstrates the fast-moving nature of this.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's perhaps worth, as the Permanent Secretary says, these figures are moving on a daily basis, if not more frequently than that. I think it's perhaps worth pausing on the summer budget revision figures. They were locked recently in order to make sure that there was certainty of reporting. And of course, both the consequentials, as I've already noted, and indeed the spending have been moving sort of broadly in tandem ever since. But perhaps if I gave you a more detailed explanation of how we have sought to fund the gap as part of the summer budget revision, because that's a very strong indicator of how we will do it to support the latest spending projections that we have. So the summer budget revision set out an intention by ministers to allocate £4.014 billion as part of the summer revision. Now, the consequentials funding that, as I noted earlier, were £3.581 billion. And that leaves a gap for Scottish ministers to fund of £433 million. Permanent Secretary and I have already both said that there has already been some reprioritisation, and that reprioritisation has enabled us to deliver £255 million worth of savings. And broadly what that means then is there's £178 million to be funded. Now, committee members might remember that when the Scottish budget was published, we had to do so in advance of knowing what the UK budget was intending to allocate as far as consequentials for this current financial year were concerned. So this is non-COVID, this is before the escalation of the crisis. Now, Scottish ministers anticipated a prudent sum. In reality, the UK government had allocated 112 million more than we had assumed. So that 112 million of additional consequentials will be applied to help to close that gap. So I said there was a gap of £178 million. So 112 million is applied to close that gap. That leaves finally 66 million in order to fund as part of the summer budget revision. Now, we are allocating all of that from the Scottish Consolidated Fund, largely from the Scotland Reserve. So those are funds that are already in the Scottish Consolidated Fund, a sum of 42 million, and 24 million that was effectively there before the Scottish Reserve was set up, and 24 million of funding since the Scottish Reserve was set up just over 3 years ago. So that's where that balance of 66 million will be funded. So it's important to point out that in ministers presenting their summer budget revision, and the evidence session that I said is taking place tomorrow, that is a fully funded application of funds. Now, as we've noted, that is moving, and it is moving on a daily basis, and we will continue to update this in real time. And of course, as I noted earlier on, there will of course be further transparent budget revisions that will set out the changes since the summer budget revision.
Can I just follow up on that? That's very helpful, Gordon, indeed, and it gives a good breakdown of how the gap is going to be funded in what is a moving picture. But can I just ask you, you said there had been already £255 million of reprioritisation savings, which is a good a nice civil service word for cuts. Where were those £255 million of savings made? So, could you send us a breakdown of that, please?
We absolutely can. From memory, it's included within the summer budget revision, but I'd be very happy to send you that. I mean, if I can just give you an example off the top of my head, the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security has already made announcements about the impact of COVID-19 on the Social Security delivery programme for this year, and we're expecting that to accrue £26 million worth of savings. So these are not, the savings that are in the summer budget revision are effectively savings that are being accrued as a consequence of the impact of COVID-19 on the government's business, rather than, if you will, spending cuts that have been decided by ministers. These are things that are flowing as a consequence of the natural events, effectively. And they are set out transparently in the summer budget revision, but be very happy to send you a detailed breakdown of the entire 255 million.
And can I also ask, obviously, the Fiscal Commission forecast £1 billion deficit over a 3-year period, and the Auditor General commented on that, about that £1 billion cumulative reduction in the Scottish budget over the next 3 years, starting, I think, the current financial year. But there's no detail within the strategy of how the Scottish Government would address such a shortfall. Now, presumably all the figures you've been talking about have not impacted positively or possibly negatively on that £1 billion figure. So is there a plan in place to deal with that deficit as well?
So worth saying, first of all, that the figures that were included within the last medium-term financial strategy, and indeed updated in the 2020-21 budget, included what we call a negative block grant adjustment. In other words, a negative impact on the Scottish budget for this very financial year, 2020-21. And as the 2020-21 budget process set out in the document, the first application of those negative block grant adjustments has already been applied. So 204 million was applied from that estimated billion in 2020-21. But you're absolutely correct, there are further deficits forecast, and the work in this year's medium-term financial strategy, which of course would normally have been published by around about this time, and the Cabinet Secretary has announced that the publication will of course be delayed to take into account the impact of COVID-19. That will of course need to impact both the impact of 2021-22 deficit projections, and those of course will take into account the latest projections from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and indeed any expected deficit in this current financial year as a consequence of COVID-19. So those two will need to feature as part of that. And of course, the 2021-22 budget process will set out, as the 2020-21 process did, what the application of a figure will be in any specific year.
Okay, that's very helpful. Can I ask a final question, Convener, back to the Permanent Secretary on a wider issue, and that is clearly this committee and other committees have been asking for the Scottish Government to produce whole consolidated public accounts on it, so that it's all in one document, and we were hoping to get that from the current financial year. Can the Permanent Secretary please give us an update on where the Scottish Government is with that project, please?
Yes, happy to, Mr. Neil. And as you'll know from my letter, which actually now is November, I think, going back on the Audit Scotland report, we agree in principle with the recommendation to improve financial reporting, and we have been continuing to progress this objective despite other pressures on ourselves, and including Gordon and his team. We do have a draft version for the 17-18 financial year. That's work that we had already undertaken. And we're currently working on the equivalent to 2018-19, and we would want to and need to have audit engagement in parallel in the work that we're doing. And we hope to have a draft account of that year available very soon. I suppose the other thing I would want to say is that it is a pretty significant and complex undertaking. So the fact that we are still working on this gives testimony not just to the fact that we've got a lot of things on our plate, but actually it is a complex process to undertake. And we want to also ensure that what is produced is valuable, is adding value. We know, and I think you know this as well, Mr. Neil, that this information that we're pulling together is available across a range of other sources. The value of this will be to bring it together into one sharp focus. So we have got work going. We've got drafts that we have shared, and another draft that we will share that will be an illustration of that work. And we will continue to place an importance on getting this done. We are at the moment struggling, as you can imagine. I think just about every part of the organisation is wrestling with the impact of this, but it doesn't mean to say that we haven't got this still in our sights.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Mr. Neil. Before I hand over to Bill Bowman, who may also have a general question around the consolidated accounts, can we get that breakdown that you offered us, Gordon, Wales, around where those savings are going to be? If you can share that document, that'd be very much appreciated. There was also a discussion there with Alec Neil around the fiscal framework. The reality is that if Scotland has a lower growth rate coming out of this crisis than the rest of the UK, that will impact our budget. and our public sector spend ability in Scotland. So what work has been done to make sure that we are mitigating the economic impact of COVID-19 and are ready to hopefully not have a drop in comparison to the rest of the UK, a weaker growth here in Scotland, which we seem to consistently have had recently?
So perhaps I could start off on that, Convener. I mean, certainly the issue of the fiscal framework is a point of live debate between ourselves and Treasury, not just at an official level, and we've heard we're having very regular contact with Treasury, but particularly at ministerial level. The fiscal framework was never designed, to be frank, very few procedures were designed to be able to cope with this kind of impact of an incident of this nature. So we are, apart from the fact that we will be looking at the framework in 2021 anyway, we are certainly putting pressure on the UK government, encouraging them to talk to us about the appropriateness of the fiscal framework in these circumstances. You also spoke about the economy, and this is where we are pivoting towards as the next phase, whilst we still continue to control and look at the exit strategy from lockdown and control of the virus. The economy is a crucial part of the work that we are undertaking. The First Minister is chairing a cabinet meeting on the economy every week. We have the Benny Higgins Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, which I think the First Minister mentioned in Parliament yesterday. That is going to be coming out in the next week or so and is focusing very much on how we pivot the economy and how the government supports economy and business through what will be very tough circumstances. And as part of its remit, it will be looking at the vulnerability of strategically vulnerable companies and the role of Scottish Government in supporting them, youth unemployment, and many of us who are I'm probably the oldest person in this virtual room at the moment, but I do very much remember 1970s and 80s and the impact on young people at that time of economic downturn. They're also looking at the vulnerability of rural communities, particularly where key sectors impact on the rural communities, such as tourism and education, including skills, the curriculum, and making more of Scotland's universities and academia. And finally, there will be, I think, giving us some recommendations on the engagement between the business community and the Scottish Government itself. So we're looking forward to Mr. Higgins' report, and that will be the first stage, if you like, of looking at the recommendations of where we need to be focusing most in our efforts to prepare for some very tough economic circumstances.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary. I remind you that you and I are probably two of the younger members on this call. We do have Bill Bowman and Alec Neil as members of the committee. I now hand over to Bill.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Permanent Secretary. I actually want to move away from the accounts per se and talk about the Audit and Assurance Committee. And before I talk about it now, if we could go back and perhaps just close off some issues that were raised earlier by the Auditor General. So just as a little bit of context, the Scottish Government Audit and Assurance Committee is responsible for providing you, the Permanent Secretary, as Principal Accounting Officer, with advice and support in discharging your responsibilities in relation to risk control and governance. Now, the Audit Committee is made up from non-executive directors. And the Auditor General's report on the 2018-19 audit of the consolidated accounts highlighted that there is a need for the Audit Committee to provide greater scrutiny and challenge to support the advice and assurances given to the Permanent Secretary. The committee receives regular reports from both internal and external audit, but the Auditor General report noted that the committee's consideration of their findings and recommendations was limited. The report also highlighted that the committee does not produce an annual report to summarise its work from the past year, nor does it undertake a review of its own effectiveness as required by its terms of reference. So the report recommended that the committee should address this to ensure that it operates within the lines of the Scottish Government's own good practice guidance on audit and assurance committees. So if I could ask you, first of all, aspects. First, do you accept the General's remarks? And second,
I think we are losing Mr. Bowman there. I'll give him a moment. Bill, have you tried? Yeah, you're back on, Bill?
I'm here as far as I know.
Yeah, you can. We lost you for a wee moment there, Mr. Bowman. If you try again, just the last part.
How far had I got?
You were just at the last part of your question.
So, did you hear my questions?
I heard that you
the last part of your questions.
The second
So
part.
the first was, do you accept the Auditor General's remarks, and what steps have been taken and by whom so that the Audit and Assurance Committee improves its effectiveness?
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman.
Thank you. Yes, I understand both of those. So I think the first thing to say was I think the non-execs on the Audit and Assurance Committee were a little surprised by some of the comments from Audit Scotland, particularly because Audit Scotland attend all of our Audit and Assurance Committees. They are a component part of it. But nevertheless, we were very keen, and I was particularly keen to ensure that we held up the performance of the committee up to the light in the light of the comments that and the evaluation that had been given. So we have taken action on this, and indeed the Audit and Assurance Committee has been a very important part of our governance during the COVID-19 crisis. So what we have done is we have got new terms of reference for the committee. We have a new chair. Ronnie Hynes has taken over as chair from Janet Hamlin, who is doing some other work now for us on the COVID response. We've doubled the number of non-execs, 5 to 10 over the past 15 months, to ensure that we have a wider breadth of skills and experience, and that we're drawing down from that pool to nominate non-execs to the Audit and Assurance Committee. These new skills include tax, youth engagement, an extensive non-exec board experience. So we have a wider and a richer set of skills around that table than we might have done previously. We have strengthened the induction process for our non-execs generally, because many of them will end up on the board, on the Audit and Assurance Committee. And Audit Scotland continue to attend not just these committee meetings, but they also attend the local Director General Assurance meetings, which feed in to the Audit and Assurance Committee. I suppose the only other thing I would say is that the intention is that we will produce a report, as was requested in one of the recommendations, and I think the proposal at the moment is that report will come before the September committee meeting for review. So we have acted on all the specific proposals which Audit Scotland have made, and we will be reviewing the performance of the committee, of course, as they also suggested, after it's had a chance to operate in this slightly new format and with this strengthened skill base.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. Can I ask then, and it was very concerning, certainly for me, and perhaps I think also for the rest of the committee, to read the comments of the Auditor General, given that we've always looked to the audit committees of organisations to be, if you like, the challenge to the management. Have you, since you imply that perhaps all of the comments were not just wholeheartedly welcomed, have you actually been back to the Auditor General to discuss this and agree what you're doing? And secondly, this sounds, a little bit internal. Have you taken any external professional guidance as to whether your, governance process and the audit committee itself are operating as they should, and that your suggestions would be in line with modern practice?
So we have kept in touch with Audit Scotland on this, not least the people who are actually at the committee, and my team have been in touch with them, not just to consider the changes that we have undertaken for SGAC, as we call it, the Audit and Assurance Committee, but also in the pipelines that feed that committee. So the Director General Assurance meetings which take place at a portfolio level, and which Audit Scotland have also been attending recently. So we have stayed close to Audit Scotland in the implementation of these changes and in the tracking of them. And they will also, of course, be seeing the report that will be coming forward in September, and will be welcome to give their assessment on that, and I would value that. In terms of external expertise, we've drawn actually quite a bit on our own new non-exec expertise, who are coming from different places, several of them from private practice, about how they see good practice happening in this holding to account and the challenge function. And we continue to look at other parts of other governments, but also other parts where non-execs point us to look at good practice, innovation, and a different way of holding ourselves to account. For my part, this is a really important element of my assurance of how the organisation is operating, not just in terms of the non-execs' expertise and challenge. And incidentally, all our non-execs are now meeting weekly. They previously met monthly, but during COVID, they've been meeting weekly. They've been asking me to present every other week, their meeting, and also they've been present to deep dives of information about COVID and how the organisation is responding to the challenge. So it's not only important for me for ESCAC to operate and function effectively, it's really important that it holds my accountable officers also to account, as they are the ones who are taking decisions day and daily in these difficult circumstances, but in work as normal if work ever gets back to normal. So it is a really important part of our governance armoury, and I take it very seriously.
Thank you for that. I'll leave it with you then, the thought of an independent scrutiny at some point of what you've done, because it sounds like you've done various aspects of it, but then do all the parts add up to the right whole, as you might say. Let me ask you then, just sorry.
No, I would say I think that's a fair comment, and I think when we get the report, I think that will be a good opportunity for us to say who else could see this and give us some feedback and ensure there's some transparency of challenge here. So I would take that away.
Yeah, thank you. I was then just going to ask, and you've alluded to it, but coming to the present situation, what active part is the Audit Committee taking in what is happening now within government?
So very active. They have already they met actually at the onset of the crisis, and they will meet. They're meeting again in another. I look at my diary now and then instantly forget, except what's happening over the next couple of days. But I think it's the next week or so that we have another ESCAC meeting. So the paperwork will be coming out for that at the end of this week. They have been also active in their role as non-execs, as I said earlier on. So we're not just waiting for ESCAC, as it were, to meet, to take its role, but non-execs have been meeting weekly, and we've had 2 corporate boards during this time of the epidemic as well, where we have a little overlap in the non-exec personnel who sit around that table. So they've been a very important point for us to be able to check in on risk, check in our preparedness for what lies ahead, check in on the nature of the governance and decision making that we are taking, and also ensuring that we have got the organisation at the best point of health as it can be under pretty testing circumstances, I have to say, to ensure that we have a sustainability in our action, not just a week by week approach to our work.
So, well, then just finally, let me ask you then, have the audit committees been just confirming what you're doing, or have you come away from these meetings and said, oh, there's something right there, we need to do it differently?
I don't think I've ever been at a meeting where it's just been an echo chamber, and that would be not operating at its best effect. We have always had challenging chairs in the ESCAC, and I myself chair corporate board, but I'm doing that on the basis of inviting comment from our non-execs. They frequently give us pause for thought, give us ideas and contacts, and challenge the way that we're doing things, because most of them don't come from a government background. And that is their extraordinary value. We do not want to be an internally focused and internally complacent organisation. We cannot afford to be ever. So there is always something that I come away with, and also I suspect my colleagues as well, in terms of both challenge and different thinking from those meetings.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Bowen. I now hand over to Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Permanent Secretary. We're all aware of the speed with which decisions need to be made in the current circumstances. However, would you agree that lessons should be learned now so that they can be reflected in new policy development, guidance and funding packages as appropriate? We can't wait years for an inquiry. I think it's vital that we learn lessons now. No one questions the intentions of ministers, but we need to understand the outcomes of those decisions. And as been mentioned before, the Parliament and the public need to play a critical role in learning lessons and understanding the outcomes of those decisions. However, there is concern amongst members of the Scottish Parliament, a number of members of the Scottish Parliament, about delayed and evasive responses from Scottish Government ministers to questions and to letters. There's also concerns about responses to freedom of information requests. My colleague Neil Finlay, for example, asked about, received an answer about First Minister not receiving any written briefings from the Chief Medical Officer or the National Chief Clinician, but that turned out not to be true, not to be the case. Do you think this is acceptable, Permanent Secretary, and what action will you take to address these concerns about a lack of transparency from the Scottish Government?
So, first of all, in terms of your point about learning and capturing learning, and I'll come on to the other points that you make in a minute, I think it's absolutely vital that we learn as we go. That I'm sure there will be an inquiry, and indeed we have a more formal process that we are sketching out at the moment, which I referred to in my opening comments about how we capture our learning, including how we bank some of the work and some of the decisions that have been taken during this time for good effect in the future. So we know that some of the impact of what we have done had some very positive effect. How sustainable that is, such as the vast reduction of people who are sleeping rough at the moment, some of the changes that have taken place so that we have far fewer people in our prisons and so on. We need to be able to think about what the sustainability of some of those outcomes are and hold on to those. And that is part of a programme of work called Renew, which will capture some of that learning and look at how we mainstream some of it. The other point I would make about learning before I come on to your point about decision making is that we are having to learn as we go in terms of some of the way that we undertake our work. We have worked at extraordinary pace, particularly in the early days of the epidemic, but it was always evidence-led with scientific and data advice woven into advice for ministers and analysis of that advice equally important. So our key craft as civil servants has remained as part of our integrity and as part of the integrity of our decision-making and governance processes that I referred to earlier on. We did have pace at the beginning with some of our decision-making, but it was underpinned by well-prepared business continuity and resilience practice. And we're now into a slightly different rhythm of decision-making now, which is predominantly conducted and orchestrated by the route map, which Shirley can say a little bit more about. Going on to your point about transparency and FOI, we have been publishing, as you know, in fact, recently we've published a whole other tranche of data and information and stats on our website, not least to do with testing, to do with the work of the COVID science group that advises Scottish Government ministers and so on. So we are, as we're going, publishing more and more of this, and that will always be the best response to the demands of FOI. The more we publish, the less likely there is that people will feel that they need to make specific demands of the government in terms of the information that it holds. So that still holds good for us. We will continue to publish and share as much information as we can. Ministers are being very upfront about decisions that they're taking to Parliament on specific initiatives. We said earlier on, as somebody mentioned, that we were going to have to make some pauses on social security services, and the Cabinet Secretary came to Parliament very early on about that. And I think the other thing I would say is we are under extraordinary. This is not an excuse. It's just a matter of fact. We are under extraordinary pressure in terms of communication, not just freedom of information, but in terms of communication and correspondence. I was talking to a Director General the other day who was talking about, since the beginning of COVID, 9,000 pieces of correspondence that were live at one point. That has been reduced down now substantially, but probably still not enough for satisfaction for people who are contacting us. And I think the other thing to be clear about this is not transactional correspondence. Certainly in the case of that Director General, the information that was coming in quite legitimately and asking and pressing for answers was actually quite complex. It was to do with applications for grants. It was to do with particular constituents' concerns being raised by MSPs. Now, I spoke to Mr. Day about this actually yesterday, it is very live in my mind and others. We need to be able to get through and pivot more resource as much as we can into dealing with the correspondence backlog, because there is one, and also ensuring that although the FOI constraints have been loosened slightly in terms of the timing and response times, we still need to be able to adhere to those. So I apologise to MSPs and others for those who have experiencing a delay in the response to their correspondence. We are doing everything we can to make sure that the process is sped up, resourcing it as well as we can, and we will do everything we can in the next few days to get rid of the backlog that I know has accrued in one or two parts of the government.
I thank the Permanent Secretary for the answer. And that undertaking. I would appreciate the civil service and ministers are working under extreme pressures, and I would just impress on the Permanent Secretary, not just an issue about the timing of responses, it's also an issue of the quality of those responses.
Noted.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Bibby. Do you have any further questions, Mr. Bibby?
No, that's me. Thank you.
I now hand over to Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning. I wonder, just a couple of questions. I wonder if I could go back to the line of questioning that was led by Alec Neil there on the finances. As I understand it, the New Zealand government are just about to borrow $50 billion to help them to get through this crisis, which they hope will save 140,000 jobs in that country, and it will help to invest in young people leaving school and university into the new world of work. Could you clarify for us, Permanent Secretary, what's the upper limit in Scotland's ability to borrow? How much can we borrow to even think about assisting our country to get through this current situation?
Yes, I'm sure Gordon will want to come into the technical elements of this, but we do not have borrowing powers. So we are not in any comparable position to other countries such as New Zealand, though indeed there is, I mentioned earlier on, a continuing and intense conversation with the UK government about how some flexibilities or indeed further powers may help the Scottish government face the next stage and the next challenge and the resonance, if I can call it that, economically for the COVID, the impact of the COVID virus. So, we have no borrowing powers. And at the moment, we are very much working within the constraints of what we do have, as we mentioned earlier on, and being able to make sure that we squeeze value out of every penny that we have coming into our coffers through tax, through Barnett consequentials, and so on. I don't know if Gordon wants to say anything more about that.
Yes, I'm very happy to. So as the Permanent Secretary says, the kind of borrowing powers that are available to the UK government, which of course are powers that are largely available to support both capital investment and indeed day-to-day borrowing powers, are nothing like that is available to Scottish ministers. The fiscal framework that was introduced as part of the 2016 Scotland Act did introduce some limited borrowing capacity. So ministers do have the ability to borrow for capital purposes. The total limit on that is £3 billion, and there is an annual limit of 450 million. So even though ministers may wish to borrow for a specific amount, they are limited by how much the Treasury will actually allow them to draw down in any given financial year. There are also some limited resource borrowing powers as well. The Scottish Government's able to borrow around £350 million a year for resource purposes, and indeed is doing so as part of its budget for 2020-21. And the resource borrowing powers are being enacted for the very first time in order to support the fiscal deficit that exists on tax. So in the discussion I was having with Mr. Neil earlier on, I mentioned that there is a £204 million adverse block grant adjustment. The Scottish Government is using those limited resource borrowing powers in the 2020-21 financial year in order to support the shoring up effectively of that deficit. So there remains some very limited additional resource borrowing powers available to ministers this year in order to support the COVID response. On the capital front, the 2020-21 budget set out an intention to borrow the entirety of that 450 million. So what that effectively means is that there is no borrowing capacity available for capital purposes that hasn't already been committed, although we have, of course, seen a bit of a slowdown in some capital expenditure in this current financial year and some very limited resource borrowing powers available.
It's even compared to a country like New Zealand, we have nothing like their capacity to deal with a situation that we both share. We're in the same boat, really, but we've got nothing like their capacity to help us borrow to get through this particular situation.
That's correct,
No.
and as I said earlier on, ministers had already set out in the 2020-21 budget a statement effectively saying that their view was that the existing fiscal framework borrowing powers and indeed the Scotland Reserve that operates alongside it is inadequate in order to support the Scottish Government's current fiscal regime, let alone the response that needs to be provided to support COVID-19. So as part of the work that needs to be done in reviewing that fiscal framework, I think that there needs to be a very substantial look again at those borrowing powers to ensure that ministers have the levers available to them to support whatever both economic and wider recovery response there needs to be. And of course, that's part of the ongoing engagement and discussion with the Treasury at the moment.
Are we getting the sense whether the UK is preferring to pay for the COVID situation by further cuts in austerity or for borrowing on something like the scale or greater than the scale that the New Zealand example are doing? Do you get the sense that we're falling towards one solution or the other here?
So I think it's worth saying, first of all, that those discussions that we're having with the Treasury, one of the levers that we're looking to have deployed here, I mentioned that, of course, as we all know, there's been a very substantial slowdown in areas such as construction. And so it's likely that we'll accrue some fairly significant capital underspends as a consequence of that. One of the discussions that we're having with the Treasury at the moment is whether or not the Scottish Government might be able to surrender some of that capital to be provided with additional an equivalent amount of resource spending. So that's one debate and discussion that's going on, and indeed other devolved administrations are having those sorts of discussions with the Treasury as well. You will already have seen that the UK government has borrowed significant amounts of money already through the UK Debt Management Office, but we know that the response to this, as far as the UK government's own fiscal response is concerned, will not be limited simply to borrowing. They have indicated that there is a review and reprioritisation programme underway at the moment within Whitehall departments, and the intention is that that will deliver a level of savings, an as yet unspecified level of savings, and of course that will provide partially the means for the UK government to be able to respond to that. We are, of course, very significantly concerned about that because the impact of decisions like that could very well be a phrase we call negative Barnett consequentials. So in other words, when the UK government spends more and there is an equivalent devolved spending line, then of course there are Barnett consequentials that are provided. In the same way that if UK spending contracts in an area that has devolved competence, then that could see a reduction in the Scottish Government's budget later this year. So we're both concerned about that from a volume perspective and indeed a timing perspective, because if the UK Government were to do this substantially later in the year, the time available to Scottish ministers to actually respond to that themselves would of course be very limited indeed.
I understand that. Convener, just one final question from me. I wanted to take the opportunity to ask the Permanent Secretary about the current situation and its impact on our various programmes of work. For example, this committee has always been interested in the IT software development projects, particularly under the social security heading and all the various software modules that are in place there. How has that been impacted, if at all, by the current situation? Because we know that the transfer of powers to enable the social security powers to come to Scotland are kind of tied to our ability to design the software in time to deliver it all. I wonder if you could just give us a little brief update on where we are with all of that, please.
Yes, of course. So I'll ask Leslie Fraser, who is responsible for the Social Security programme, to come in. But I think just before she does, just a sentence. We've been looking at every area of our work with Cabinet Secretaries very carefully, and will continue to do that to see where there is opportunity to loosen up, delay, pause, or free up some resource, both financial and staffing. I would say that, wouldn't I, as being responsible for the staffing element as well. But often this is about slight delay or pause. It's not about stopping or ceasing something. It's often to do with what we can free up if we move things down the calendar line a little bit more. But Leslie will probably want to say particularly about the social security and the IT element to which you refer. Leslie.
Thanks very much. Yes, indeed, as the Social Security Cabinet Secretary has made clear, we have had to pause some elements of the programme, particularly in relation to the devolution of disability benefits. Actually, that's not been principally driven by IT requirements. It's been driven more, in fact, of course, by the availability of health staff and medical staff to help us design the assessment procedures. And we are maintaining the ongoing programmes in terms of IT to be able to continue the devolution of social security powers as and when we've got the access to those medical staff again to be able to help us with that assessment process. So there is a pause, and it's principally driven by the health and social care impact, and the IT and the main programme continues. And of course, the Cabinet Secretary has also made it clear that it's been an absolute priority for us to maintain the delivery of a really vital public service to people in Scotland as well. And I'm incredibly proud, I think, of what colleagues in Social Security Scotland have been able to do, moving that entire agency online and maintaining the delivery of our existing benefits to the people of Scotland.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Leslie. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. Permanent Secretary, I just have two final questions. Slightly off topic, but still topical and relevant. We currently are living through the Black Lives Matter movement, and I welcome the signs of solidarity that you and others in the Scottish Government have shown in taking the knee and in showing solidarity with minority communities. But to be frank, it will be actions that people will judge the Scottish Government on and officials on, rather than their words. You lead one of the most chronically underrepresented organisations in our country. What action are you taking to address that?
Well, thank you, Convener. Yes, I agree. We have much more to do. And this week, actually, not just in terms of gestures I may have made, but in terms of what's going on within the world, has redoubled my efforts and indeed focused the organisation even more sharply on this. I'll give you a couple of examples. We have done a lot of work in trying to ensure that our recruitment, when we are able to externally recruit, reflects the diversity of Scotland and the diversity and inclusion policies of the organisation. So we have done quite practical things there in terms of where we recruit, how we attract people, bringing people into the organisation before they decide to apply for a job to see whether it will work for them or not, how we are opening up our interest to schools and universities, and modern apprentices, our graduate development scheme. Those large-scale external recruitments have attracted a much more diverse set of applicants than we have previously had. We now have the highest level of minority ethnic colleagues in the senior civil service that we've ever had. I think at a population in Scotland of about 5%, we now have it's gone from 3 to 4% in the senior civil service. Not enough, but it is working. We're doing quite a lot of mentoring support for our talent pipeline to ensure that we're encouraging people to move up and through the organisation. More broadly, what I am particularly keen and have been emphasising in my own communications and my challenge to the organisation is how we ensure that our policy making, our work for the National Performance Framework, that we really are hearing all the voices. And the expert reference group, which the First Minister referred to earlier on in the week, is already giving us, judging by its first meeting yesterday, real food for thought in how we are ensuring that what we claim to be important to the organisation is carried out both in our organisation responsibilities as an employer, which I take very seriously, but also in the work we do. It's not just who we are, it's how we work. And I would be happy to give a more detailed response to the committee if that's helpful about some of the other strands of work that we're undertaking at the moment.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary. I'll come in a moment to the reference group. You'll recall that I wrote to you about 18 months ago with a number of suggestions around how we can increase the representation of BME communities in our public sector. Part of that was asking for a race disparity audit to be done across the sector in Scotland. Part of that was looking at a fully funded mentoring scheme to try and encourage more talent. Some of that was looking at how we look at our interview processes around blind CVs, etc., and implementing the Rooney rule, where we have a shortlist of at least one BME candidate. Will you commit to at least take these suggestions forward? We have, for example, the Equal Representation of Public Boards Act, where we aspire to have 50% of women representation on our public boards. There is no requirement to have BME representation on our public sector boards. These are the practical steps people want to see you and your government make, and the organisation you lead make. Will you commit to do that?
I will respond to you again on the issues that you raised and give you an update on what we have already implemented, what we're exploring. Some of them are quite complex, and the impact of those that we've already implemented. For example, we already ask other parts of government and other organisations to help us with our recruitment panels to ensure that we have minority ethnic community representation on our community panels. We can't always, because we don't always have enough free people in our own organisation to do that, populate that for our own teams. But we've been, for example, we have helpfully borrowed colleagues from the Treasury who were able to come and sit in our interview panels for some of the work that we were doing on external recruitment not long ago. So I will happily commit to write back to you on the basis of my previous letter and give you an update on what we have done, what's still in train, and what we've also evaluated in terms of the impacts of those changes.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary. And you mentioned the reference group. As of last night, I haven't had a chance to discuss it with them this morning, but as of last night, a coalition of over 70 BME organisations in Scotland said that they had no idea who were the members of the reference group, and no consultation had been done with them about who the members of that reference group are. Can you shed any light on that, please?
So I am aware that they met for the first time yesterday. I do not see any reason why we would not be publishing the names and people who are on that group. And my understanding from what I've heard, and this was just a snapshot this morning actually of the group's deliberations, is that they would be very keen to be working with and hearing from other groups. So again, happy to write to you and give you an update on both the publication of what the group is doing, its terms of references and so on, and how it will be engaging with the wider community.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary. For those that are watching that may not know what we're speaking of, it's the reference group that the First Minister mentioned, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on BME communities in Scotland. Thank you, Permanent Secretary, for that work. Are there any final comments you wish to make, Permanent Secretary?
No, I think we've given a good exploration of some of the key issues. Thank you, Convener.
Well, can I once again take the opportunity to thank you and all your team for working around the clock for what I know is a very challenging time in a period of emergency. So thank you to all your work for those efforts. I know it's an anxious time for everybody, so I sincerely wish you, your team and all your families all the very best. And thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
I will now suspend briefly for us to have a changeover of witnesses. I welcome back those watching the meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Lecture Scrutiny Committee. We move to agenda item 4, which is the Section 23 report on affordable housing, the Scottish Government's affordable housing supply target. Can I welcome Caroline Gardner, the Auditor General for Scotland, Claire Sweeney, the Assistant Director, and Kate Berry, Audit Manager, Performance, Audit and Best Value from Audit Scotland. Can I invite the Auditor General to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. This is a joint report with the Accounts Commission. It reports on progress towards the Scottish Government's target to deliver 50,000 affordable homes between April 2016 and April 2021. It also considers what more the Scottish Government and councils need to do to continue to increase affordable housing for those who need it. Our work concluded before the COVID-19 health crisis, which will have a significant impact on the delivery of the target. That's not reflected in the report, but our findings and recommendations remain relevant. The Scottish Government's target is substantial and challenging, and good progress has been made. But there are serious risks to delivering the remaining homes regardless of the current health crisis. These include a lack of capacity in the construction sector in some areas, and the capacity of council planning and building control services. The planned rise of funding towards the end of the programme and uncertainty about funding post-2021 intensifies these risks. The target was a response to evidence of the need for more affordable housing in Scotland, but it's not clear how councils' local assessments of need inform the specific target and the balance of tenures. This means that it's not possible to assess whether the Scottish Government's investment is targeted most effectively to deliver new homes of the right types in the right places. Councils are generally working well with their partners to plan and deliver affordable homes, but health and social care partners need to be more involved. We saw some good examples of community and tenant involvement, but some councils could involve tenants and communities earlier in project planning to help ensure that the wider benefits of investment are maximised. The investment is allowing councils to meet some of the housing needs in their areas, and there's also evidence of wider community benefits such as local employment and training opportunities. Overall, though, monitoring of the programme focuses on the numbers of homes being built rather than the wider impact. Affordable housing does make a big contribution to many other Scottish Government policies, such as reducing child poverty, and the Government could have done more to set out how its affordable housing target linked to other policies and to the outcomes it aims to achieve from its investment. The Government is now developing its longer-term plans for housing, and I hope this report will be useful as it takes the work forward with its partners. As always, Convener, my colleagues and I are happy to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you, Auditor General. Before I turn to Colin Beattie, you referenced this in your opening remarks about the impact of COVID-19. I know that the report obviously will not look retrospectively about what's happened in the last few months, but can you give any thoughts or what this means in terms of achieving the target, the impact that COVID-19 in terms of the lockdown will have had, and also the impact it may have longer term on the construction industry in Scotland, and what that means for achieving our target?
We know there will be an impact. As you suggest, Convener, the construction sector stopped work pretty much across the piece in the middle of March, and it's only now in the phase of preparing to resume as we head towards phase 2 of the easing of lockdown restrictions. It's not possible to quantify what the impact of that will be. You heard from Gordon Wales earlier about the delays on construction projects more generally in the Scottish Government's investment programme. All of that, I think, will have to be looked at as the sector gets back to work, as to how far it's simply a matter of resuming what was already planned and how far there may have been a loss of capacity in some parts of the sector. We don't know that. But I think it's important for me to be clear that we thought even before COVID-19 there were risks to the achievement of the target due to a lack of capacity in construction in some parts of the country and a lack of capacity in councils' planning and building control services.
And just as a follow-up to that, when will you be looking at this again in terms of assessing this period where we've had the COVID-19 crisis?
As I've spoken to the committee about before, Audit Scotland is currently in the process of looking at how we pivot our own work to respond to the crisis. Some of what we will be doing is looking very directly at the impact of COVID-19 on the public finances and public services. Some parts of the performance audit programme will remain relevant, and some will either be delayed or switched out for things which have risen up the priority list. We'll be talking to you about that in a bit more detail at the end of this month, but I can give you an assurance, I think, that Audit Scotland will continue to monitor progress on the affordable housing target, even though I can't at this stage give you a date on when they'll be reporting on it.
Thank you, Auditor General. I'll now hand over to Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Auditor General, your report discusses the risks to delivery, and you highlight two particular areas of high risk to achieving the March 2021 target. And these are delays to construction because of the lack of skilled labour, and delays in planning permission and other building consents. Obviously, there's pressures at a council level. Could you maybe expand on these risks pre-COVID-19 and indicate how widespread these risks are, in fact, across council areas in terms of their ability to cope with this?
With your permission, Convener, I'll ask Kate Berry to pick that question up for you. She's all over the detail on these questions.
Thank you. Yeah, we identify a number of risks to the programme, and it's maybe worth giving a bit of context to those risks. The programme was planned to, the funding for the programme was planned to rise towards the end of the 5-year programme. And that means we're expecting a rise in completions towards the end of that programme. So this means that there would be a sort of bunching of completions towards the last 2 years. So we think that this exacerbates some of those existing risks about the lack of construction, the capacity in some areas. In terms of the scale of those risks about construction capacity, there's been a report commissioned by the government on the Short Life Working Group on Housing Skills. That report has been published and identified particular shortages in the southeast of Scotland and the Highlands and Islands, and particular shortages in certain skills, for example, bricklayers and site managers. So we haven't been able to quantify the exact nature of those skills risks throughout the country, but we know there's particular risks in geographical areas. And what we heard from our fieldwork was that Brexit might exacerbate those risks again, where, for example, workers in the industry might go to projects down south where the pay might be higher, for example. In terms of the risks of the council capacity, again, the point about the increase in completions towards the end of the programme, there's a potential risk there. Again, work we've quoted in our report identifies surveys that highlight some of the pressures on the workforce in the building services and planning teams. There's a potential high number of retirees, and there was recommendations in the Short Life Working Group on Skills about recruitment of those professionals. And as yet, we're still to see a government response to that, but those issues are definitely being considered as part of the government's risk management.
I think focusing on the council issue, we all know that in most council areas there's been a serious reduction in number of staff in planning departments and so forth, and that's a worry. I've had complaints from developers that it takes 2 years and more to get planning permission through, which seems to me a long time. You don't actually have any statistics as to how commonplace that is. Is it commonplace, or is it patchy, or don't you have the information?
We don't have.
Carry on, Kate.
Sorry, I was just going to say we don't have concrete data. Our local government overview report, which is due at the end of June, and we'll have some more information on the risks to planning and the pressures on council planning services. But I can't quantify that at the moment. We do quote some information in our report about there was a survey of local authority building services that found 81% of councils' building standards teams had reduced in full-time equivalent numbers, and potentially 25% of the existing workforce could retire within the next 5 years.
Have you found any indication that councils are addressing this problem?
In terms of the wider approach to that, this wasn't a particular focus of our audit. We've identified that as a risk that needs to be managed both by the Scottish Government in terms of longer term skills identification and by local councils.
I suppose the other thing is this question of lack of skilled labour on the construction sites has been highlighted in previous audit reports. Again, I would ask the same question, which you may or may not have the answer to. Is there any indication that these are being addressed in any meaningful way? It's not new.
You're right, it's not new, and one of the issues that we identify in our report is about the deliverability of plans in local areas. And if we note the substantial increase from the previous target, this was a key concern at the start, that there wouldn't be capacity to deliver that substantial increase. You know, it takes time to kind of step up plans, to get the skilled labour and to get enough staff to make the plans happen. So we think maybe in the future that there's lessons that the government could learn about thinking about the deliverability of targets that are set. In our report, we do identify some action that registered social landlords and councils are taking. The funding has allowed them to recruit apprentices and offer work placements, which will help build skills locally.
Okay. Now, the report concluded at the point of its publication that the target, particularly the social rent element, was at a serious risk of not being met. What is the current assessment? Is there any update on that?
I think I said in my... Sorry, Kate, I'll take this one and then ask you to add any detail you've got. I think, as I said in my answer to the convener's question, we know that it would have been difficult in any case. COVID-19 has made it, I think, impossible, and I think the government has acknowledged that it won't now be possible to meet the target by March 2021. And the question now that we think is important is for the government, alongside all of the other things it requires to do, to really be setting out its plans post this current programme, which was due to end in March 2021. The uncertainty about funding and the targets thereafter was one of the factors that was making it harder for councils and registered social landlords to plan. But the hiatus we've seen, the disruption to the economy, I think make it all the more important to be thinking longer term about how much the government intends to be able to invest and what it wants that investment to achieve. Kate, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add to that.
I would only just add that we know the Scottish Government had been closely monitoring the target, so we expect that they will be doing that, and the area teams were working closely with councils in their regional areas, and they have regular meetings about the progress of their plans. So we would expect that work to be continuing now and the government to be considering what the impact is.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I now hand over to Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. Auditor General, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, first about affordability and then about specialist housing. So on affordable, you say at paragraph 14, there is no common definition of affordability and that this can be confusing for tenants and the public, and that during the audit, stakeholders not closely involved in delivering the target were not always clear what the Scottish Government meant by affordable. So, do you know what affordable means, and is it a case of this not really being defined at the outset of the programme, or is it a communication issue?
I think honestly it's a case that it's complex. What we break down the target itself, the target was for 50,000 new affordable homes between April 2016 and March 2021. Within that, the intention was that homes for social rent would make up 35,000 of the target, delivered by councils and registered social landlords, and homes for mid-market rent and homes for affordable home ownership would make up the other 15,000. The complication is that what's affordable in any particular instance depends on both the household makeup, people's income, their other circumstances, the size of the family, and also the local environment. So there isn't a figure that it's possible to put on what affordable housing means in any of those categories. But I think the point we were trying to convey was that the targets are well understood within the councils and registered social landlords and wider housing associations who are involved in this, but perhaps not well understood to the wider public and to people like you and me.
So does that mean that when you say the local environment, we could have a different definition in different parts of the country, and then different people saying they've met the target, and we were sort of comparing apples and oranges because they're not exactly the same targets money-wise?
They're certainly not the same target money-wise. Just to take one simple example within that, within the homes for affordable home ownership category, we know that the limits are very different, for example, between Inverclyde and Edinburgh, for reasons that I think we would intuitively understand, but it doesn't mean you can put a figure on it and say this is the cap that applies across Scotland.
Sort of within that, you also note that there's an expectation of the rent that would be charged for social housing funded through the programme only applies to the first let, and thereafter, what happens in fact thereafter?
I'll ask Claire, if I may, to talk you through that. Claire's our expert on affordability.
Thank you, Auditor General. So after the first let, the RSL's own rent setting policy would apply. So it does revert back to the rent policy that is in place for each of the registered social landlords. It's not something we looked at in any great detail in terms of the appropriateness or otherwise. It's not for us to conclude on that. But yes, that is the arrangement as it happens locally.
So does that mean there's an opportunity to get funds from this programme, looking perhaps the longer term, then you have an affordable rent to begin with, and then you could go back to a less affordable rent?
So it's something that will vary locally, absolutely. In the report, we've tried to set out some of the factors that will be taken into consideration by social landlords as they set their own rent policy, and they do vary, absolutely they do. It's also perhaps worth mentioning that in our previous report on housing in Scotland back in 2013, we did say that there needs to be a bit more clarity around affordability. And since then, the programme guidance around affordable housing has built in some assumptions. So there are some parameters built into guidance for councils carrying out housing needs and demand assessments to try and build in some of those broad assessments, but trying to pin down a kind of one-size-fits-all for what is affordable is just not practical. So yes, there are variations across registered social landlords and local authority arrangements.
Let me ask you then about specialist housing needs. You discuss at paragraph 60, I think, the provision of new affordable housing that meets special needs for older people and those with disabilities. Between 2016-17 and 18-19, 1,577 homes were purpose-built for older people and 742 for disabled people. I mean, do you have an idea if this is a sufficient number, and where did these actual figures come from?
One of the challenges that we highlight in the report is that although it's clear that the 50,000 target overall was a response to general housing need that had been identified not least by organisations like the Chartered Institute of Housing, the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and Sheltered Scotland, it's not clear how that 50,000 target was informed by individual councils' assessments of demand and need in their areas, and particularly the sorts of dimensions of that need that you're describing, Mr. Bowman, housing for older people or people with special needs. That's one of the reasons why we think the target itself could be more clearly linked to that assessment of need in future, and that the monitoring of its achievement could be more nuanced and more transparent to let us know how well it's meeting the need and the wider outcomes that the government's trying to achieve through its investment. I think Kate very may want to add a bit to that. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to what Caroline said. Just to, you asked about where did these figures come from. So these figures are reported in the Scottish Government's annual affordable housing outturn reports. So that gives information on what the programme has been spent on, the amount spent on each type of programme, the number of completions in each council area. What is not reported on is the number of these purpose-built houses by council area. So we have identified that there could be some improvements in the comprehensive nature of the Scottish Government's reporting. So these are units that are purpose-built for those particular types of housing need, but we do also note in that paragraph that this might not be the full number of what's actually being provided, because some might be suitable for those types of people, but wouldn't be classified as purpose-built.
What I was going to say was that I would expect housing for older people would have certain themes running through it that are a common need for older people, but for disabled people, they could be very specialist in terms of the needs they have. Do you get any further information on what type of specialisation the properties have for those with disabilities?
Yeah, yes, it could be quite wide-ranging. The government expects that all properties funded through its grant funding programme will meet what's called housing for varying needs, which is a kind of low-level kind of standard that might suit different mobility problems. There will be people that have particular specialist needs, for example, wheelchair users that might require other support, that require different types of standards of housing. And what we saw in some areas was that councils will work with people that they have identified that need particular types of housing to build in features that could support their particular needs. That can't always take place because the need for wheelchair or particular needs housing can't always be predicted. But we have seen some element of joint assessment there and kind of designing the house to meet the particular needs of the tenant that has been identified.
And just a final question on the needs of, let's say, disabled people. When houses are built to meet a specific need, are they designed in a way that they can be repurposed if that person moves or somebody else moves in?
Again, that would depend on the particular design of the property. We do identify in the report that a council is looking at building properties that are a bit more flexible. So, for example, there would be room to install a wet room shower if need be, so that can account for people's changing circumstances. So that even if a person was to move out of a specialised accommodation, there's work could be done to make it suitable to meet the needs of the next occupant. But again, it would just vary depending on individual councils and individual developments.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. I now hand over to Alex Neil.
Thank you, Convener. Can I first of all declare an interest in that, as the then Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice with responsibility for housing, it was me who drafted and submitted the paper to Cabinet for the funding and the programme to build 50,000 houses. Can I ask the Auditor General if she had access to that Cabinet paper?
I will have to hand that question on to the team. I certainly haven't seen it personally, but I'll ask Claire or Kate to let you know whether either of them has seen it.
Sorry, I have not. I'm not sure if Kate has through some of the detailed work.
We've had access to a number of Scottish Government documents, but I can't recall. I don't think we saw the initial Cabinet paper.
Right. The reason I ask is if you dig out that paper, actually it did address a lot of the issues that you've said were not being addressed. It did look at why 50,000 was the right figure. It did look at the skill shortages challenge, address that, and it did look at other issues like land availability and so on. So actually, the original policy decision of the Cabinet, it was a very comprehensive paper. I remember it very well indeed. In actual fact, the Cabinet did identify most, if not all, of these issues as needing to be addressed. I think the issue is, why were they not subsequently addressed? And I think clearly that's where we need to find out why not. Can I take the issue, for example, of skills shortages? I mean, the latest figure from the CITB is an estimate of skill shortages of 12,500 people with the relevant skills we're short of in Scotland for the whole construction sector, not just for this programme, but for the whole construction sector, mainly the wet trades. Can I ask if you spoke to the CITB about their estimate of the skill shortages?
I'll take the first part of that question, if I may, Mr. Neal, about the evidence for the target. I think that's a question for government as to why they didn't provide that evidence to us. It's something that we've been asking for through the process of this audit, and particularly at the stage where we clear the draft report for factual accuracy. They will have seen our findings that the evidence wasn't available to us. And that's the point at which we make a final check that there isn't something we should have seen that we haven't. So I think that is a question to pick up with government if that's the case. Claire and Kate, I think, is the person to talk to about who we spoke to on the skills agenda. Kate, over to you, please.
So as part of our audit, we interviewed a number of stakeholders, mainly within our case study areas. And we spoke to a number of other external stakeholder bodies. We didn't speak to any representative of the construction industry directly, but we used evidence from a number of reports, and including the Short Life Working Group Skill report, which has some estimates about construction sector in it.
Okay, because one of the things you mentioned, Kate, was that some people had said that Brexit had been the problem or contributed to the problem. And the reason given for that, you said, was because some people were being attracted by better money down south. Can I say they've always had better money down south? And that process has accelerated in recent years. And the main reason for that, nothing to do with Brexit, it was happening long before Brexit. The reason it was happening was because a lot of the UK house builders decided, because of the planning problems up here and because of other issues, that they were going to focus their investment in places like Birmingham rather than in Scotland. And indeed, in the last year or so, about half a dozen national house builders would take the decision to withdraw from Scotland because they reckon they can make more profit in places like Birmingham and Manchester. So I think it's a bit more nuanced, it's a bit more comprehensive than maybe you're suggesting.
I understand there's a wide range of reasons. Our audit didn't really go into the detail behind all the construction industry and the changes in that industry and the reasons for that. Our main point is that in terms of delivery of the target, this is a risk, and Brexit might potentially exacerbate those risks.
Yeah, but you have to put it in context. You can't just say Brexit. I mean, this is the answer to everything. Blame Brexit, and there's no evidence. Where's your evidence that Brexit was partly to blame, other than anecdotal?
I don't think we're blaming Brexit in the report. I think we've identified this.
You're saying it's a contributing. You've said this morning verbally it's a contributing factor to the skill shortage. Where in your report is the evidence of that?
We are saying it could be potentially in paragraph 96. We say it could be potentially exacerbated by EU withdrawal.
Well, where's the evidence for that? Where's
Can
the
I
evidence?
step in?
I'll hand over to our general. I think potentially exacerbating doesn't necessarily say it's definitely causing it. But I'll hand over. I'll hand over to I'll let the Auditor General come back in.
There's no evidence.
I'm going to hand over to the
Thank you, Convener. I think the point we're making in the report, Mr. Neal, is absolutely that that shortages in the construction industry are a risk to the delivery of the target and to the continuing ability to meet the needs for affordable housing across Scotland. You're right, there's a range of factors that underpin that. And the wider point we're making, I think, is that therefore it's important that government looks at deliverability as well as housing need in thinking about the target it wants to set, the timescale over which it wants to deliver it, and the location and balance of tenures which is involved in that. And I understand that Brexit is one of those topics which evokes strong views, and we don't have evidence at this stage of what the impact will be at the end of the transitional period. That the wider point of the report is about the importance of deliverability and the continuing risk of shortages in the construction sector.
I accept the wider point because there is evidence that that is the case. However, I think in an audit report, you shouldn't be saying something is a potential contributor unless you'll get evidence to that effect. And I don't see the evidence.
I think the evidence on which we base the assertion, and as the convener said, we were careful to caveat it as being a potential factor that was exacerbated, but it reflects...
no evidence of a potential Brexit impact. If you're saying it has a potential impact, even with the use of the word potential, if it's an audit report, it should provide evidence. The whole point of your report says, quite rightly, you demand the government produces evidence. You've made a statement in this report and you haven't produced any evidence to back it up, even on a potential basis.
I think you've made your point on several occasions, Mr. O'Neill, if you want to move on to the next question.
Right, okay, will do. Could I ask if about land availability? Because clearly land is a major cost. Across Scotland as a whole, it typically represents 25% of the cost of new housing on average. That varies obviously widely, but in terms of land availability, how important do you think that is to the constraint? I mean, obviously skill shortages, I think we all accept is a major constraint, but land and planning is, as well as Colin rightly said. But land availability, particularly in rural areas, can be a major problem because there's no obligation on private landowners having to give up a percentage of land for social housing.
You're right. We highlight the availability of land that's suitable for development and land with the necessary infrastructure as one of the risks looking forward to the next period, which is increasing uncertainty around that. Kate, I think you're probably the person to pick up that question.
Yeah, we identify a number of challenges to meeting affordable housing in Scotland, and one of those is the availability of land. That will vary the pressures on land will vary geographically. We've identified some pressures in rural areas. One of the issues that stakeholders told us about was the condition of some of the land that's been left. So obviously we've had quite a big building programme so far, and some of the easier sites, if you like, have been built on. So now what's left in some areas is more brownfield sites, work that might need a bit more time and money spent on it to make it preparable for building on. We identify some of the actions that our government and councils are taking to address the wider challenges to providing affordable housing. And we identify in part 3 in our diagram some of those issues. So for example, at a council level, councils can use their council section 75 affordable housing policies to kind of overcome issues where land supply is in short supply.
Down the years under successive governments, right from way before the Scottish Parliament was established, part of housing policy has been to take equity to provide, the government takes typically up to 40% equity in new housing. Now, if you look at the total historic value at purchase price value of that equity, it's hundreds of millions of pounds. If you look at the market value of these houses, it's probably well over £1 billion. Have you had a chance to look in detail at that? Because it seems to me we're sitting with, at a crucial time when the Scottish Government needs money, we're sitting with all that equity tied up, which potentially could be released to make those funds available, for example, to invest in new housing. Is that something you have or will be looking at in more detail?
It's not something we've looked at in detail in this report, Mr. Neal, but it's certainly something the committee may want to explore with the Scottish Government, and I'm sure it's something that the new Auditor General will want to take into account when he's looking at the new performance audit programme, looking ahead after the review that's currently underway. There clearly are long-term issues about the value of homes here, and the way in which the government chooses to use its financial transactions budget to invest. And I think it would be entirely appropriate to explore that with government.
I mean, obviously a related issue is the value of Help to Buy. I mean, I am a sceptic about whether Help to Buy is good value for money, I have to say. I think it basically pushes up prices and pushes up the profits of the construction companies, and really doesn't, it's a bit of dead weight. I don't think it actually adds a great deal to the total supply of housing. Is that another area that you're looking at all?
The Help to Buy scheme isn't within the 50,000 target, as I'm sure you know. No. I think my colleagues in the National Audit Office have looked at it as being primarily a UK government target, and they've expressed some reservations as well about its effectiveness. And again, I think it's one of the things that my successor as Auditor General will want to look at in the work programme going forward from here.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Auditor General and your team. I'd like to look at the council funding that you've got around page 17 and onwards in your report. Just a particular section on that. Your report indicates that the Scottish Government can reallocate funds if a council's unable to spend its funding within a given year, but perhaps for slippage or some such like that. You then go on in your report to say that it is not always clear on how decisions to reallocate funding are made. Now, when you say not always clear, does that mean that sometimes it is clear, or is that the sort of euphemism for it's not clear at all that I tend to use, to be honest? And in any event, what needs to change, and will it?
I'm going to bring Kate in on the detail. We try not to use euphemisms, but to be precise, so I'm sure we mean it's not always clear, but Kate can tell you more about the detail that underlies that.
So councils are allocated sort of their local programme funding, and that they get notice of what that will be over a 3-year period, and that allows them to work with their partners to plan for projects over those 3 years. So as you've acknowledged, sometimes there might be delays in particular projects, and there might be particular reasons why all that money couldn't be spent in one particular year. For example, if a council is master planning an area for regeneration, that might take a lot of time at the start, and then it might slip over. So there is generally a bit of movement within the government programme, and that's not new. That's kind of was part of the last programme. But I think what we were getting at was sort of it wasn't always clear about the basis on which decisions to move that funding was made and why one bit of funding would be moved to another area. There's obvious reasons about deliverability, but I think what would be important is to look at the spend over the 5-year programme, because as we've identified, there's some quite big variations between council areas. So it would be good to get under the skin of that a bit more at the end of the 5-year programme, and maybe be clearer about why decisions are being made to move to a particular council area. The government, to be fair, do say that they try and keep the funding within this sort of broad regional area, so the benefit of that movement of funding will benefit the wider regional housing market.
Yeah, I mean, forgive me pushing back on that, Kate. I mean, really, what my question is on this is, if it's not always clear, that is not always desirable. And if I was sitting where the government was, I'd say, or certainly where the councils were, I think I'd say, I want the clarity. I want to know what the criteria are for when there's slippage, how the money is going to be reallocated. Do you then get any sense that someone is having that conversation and will do something about it?
We know the area teams work quite closely with the local offices, so they will have a good understanding of programming issues at a local level. But in terms of the documentation that we could see, it wasn't always that clear if there was any guidelines about how these decisions might be made, for example.
Okay, I'll move on. You're in a similar section, so just sort of staying in that area, your report then notes that councils and RSLs are investing significant resources of their own to meet this target, but it's difficult to calculate the total investment. So it would seem important to me that we have an overall figure for the investment. So are steps being taken to try and address this so that at the end of the programme, we can actually tell very clearly how much public money has been spent and benchmark that against what has actually been achieved?
So in the government's
on you go, Kate. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, in the government's outturn reports, they have quite a bit of information about expenditure data. What we've identified is that we have information on the data on projects when they're approved. So in some cases, costs may rise after they're approved, but we don't have that data. So we don't necessarily think it's a great deal, but trying to get an exact figure of the additional expenditure that has been made, we find it hard to get an exact figure for that. But we do note the costs of what the additional funding have been in terms of what's been approved. And as for what the government might be doing to improve that information, I think that would be a question for the government.
Okay, I'll put that question to the government because really the question is, I know we can't get a figure. What is somebody doing to address that? So, but it's a fair point, Kate. I'll put it to the government. Final thing from me, convener. You also say at paragraph 41 that if an approved project goes over budget and the council or the RSL pays the extra, that isn't recorded. Now, given the challenges that Scotland's councils are facing in terms of their budgets, this seems surprising to me. Oughtn't the Scottish Government to be capturing this? And if so, do you get any indication that they will?
The government would know if projects rise after a project is approved if the council or RSL went back to seek further grant funding. That doesn't always happen. As I say, we don't think it's probably a big sum of money, but it's probably not comprehensive.
Yes, but it's not recorded.
No, it's not recorded.
I find that rather surprising, but perhaps that's another question I'll put to the Scottish Government. Convener, that will do me this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. I now hand over to Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning. Caroline, I just wanted to ask a little question about the role of health and social care partnerships in taking forward housing. I appreciate that the report was basically researched and produced pre-COVID, but do you get a sense that since this health emergency, since this disaster, we're all beginning to kind of rethink about how we do things better and differently in the future? And does that also apply to housing programmes that we can see in front of us and in your report? Could you maybe give us a little flavour of how you might see that impacting on how we deliver these kinds of programmes in the future and how that might involve closer working partnerships with our health and social care partnership teams?
I think that's a great question, Mr. Coffey. You know from work that we've published in the past, first of all, that the government has been very ambitious in terms of its outcomes approach in the National Performance Framework, and that one of the ways that it's aimed to improve the health and well-being of the people of Scotland is through much closer working between health and social care, but also health and housing, health and a range of other public services that contribute towards the health of the population. We've reported that the outcomes approach isn't always followed through in terms of decision making and allocating money and other resources, and particularly that health and social care partnerships, the integration authorities, haven't really had the impact that they were intended to yet. One of my personal hopes is that alongside all of the loss and devastation we've seen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we do start to look much more closely at the way all of these things are interlinked and how we can make use of the resources we've got, which are bound to be constrained in the near future, to have more of an impact on the lives of the people who need it most. You heard from the Permanent Secretary earlier a little bit about the work they're doing on renewal, looking ahead to the new programme for government. I would really like to see decisions about how much is being invested into housing, for example, in this instance, very closely linked to the way those houses can also help to improve child poverty, to improve the health of people with disabilities or older people, to be thinking about economic regeneration in a sustainable way in local communities. None of that is easy, but it does feel as though there's a real opportunity to do it, and we've all recognised how much it matters as a result of the impact of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. As far as I can make out, there's about 40,000 or so of our citizens actually live in care homes in Scotland just now, and we know that there's a linkage between the services that we deliver to the system. But I'm thinking, is there a case to be made, do you think, to be thinking more innovatively, perhaps, about how we look after our senior citizens in the future, whether it is in a care home model or whether it is a housing and living at home model with enhanced services provided by the councils or whoever to support people to live in their own accommodation closer to and amongst their own families? Is that, I know that's a little bit of vision gazing for you, and perhaps you don't want to make comments on that, but I would really appreciate any thoughts that you might have in that possible direction of travel for the future, given what we've been through at the moment.
I'm happy to start that off, and I'll then bring Claire Sweeney in, Mr. Coffey. In a sense, that's what I've been saying in my reports on the NHS over the last 8 years, that the NHS is increasingly caught in this short-term problem of trying to deal with the needs of older people who actually don't have acute healthcare needs fundamentally. They have needs for social care and support, and a lot of that will be about housing, which enables them to stay safely at home and for the house to adapt and grow around them as perhaps they become frailer or their needs change. Claire is absolutely focused on these issues as part of our work with us, and I'll ask her to add to that if I may.
Thanks, Auditor General. I think part of the issue in terms of the COVID response is an opportunity to start to look at how services are delivered differently and put the citizen at the heart of some of those discussions. And we can see that some of that started. So, for example, the response around homelessness issues, but there are some risks to this going forward. We know that the pressure around economic factors, capacity, we've talked a little bit about already, would feature on everybody's risk registers. So definitely a feature. And just in terms of those partnerships coming together and being at the table to help make those more radical decisions with communities. We reference in the report that our previous work around health and social care integration, very similar barriers we saw in this report, getting in the way of that really good visionary approach to working across systems. So things there that you'll have heard from us before around different cultures, resource pressures, leadership and direction not quite being where it needed to be. So there is an ambition, there is an enthusiasm. You'll see at paragraph 46, we mentioned specifically that the Scottish Public Health Network said that there was real enthusiasm for doing things differently and a closer involvement with health and social care partnerships, which will be at the root of getting those different arrangements in place for people in care homes and older people. But it's trying to realise that in a practical sense where we sometimes stumble, I think.
Okay, thank you very much for that insight. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. I now hand over to Neil Bibby.
Well, thanks, Convener. Your report discusses the importance of tenant and community involvement in plans for new affordable housing, but suggests approaches are mixed across council areas. I know you've highlighted South Lanarkshire as a good example. What steps have been taken to ensure that good practice is being shared in this regard?
This is something which we've looked at very closely in this report, but which the Accounts Commission has got a great interest in terms of community engagement more generally. And we've published some work on principles for community empowerment recently. Claire, I wonder if you can pick up what good practice looks like and what we've seen elsewhere.
Thank you. Yes, the principles we published around community empowerment were drawn together from a very wide engagement with experts looking at community empowerment across a whole range of different services and areas, particularly focused on things like regeneration of communities. And we saw some common things there that made community engagement a success. We learned a lot through that piece of work. There were 5 big areas that we highlighted. One was about communities having real control, a real sense of driving the agenda. Public sector leadership, so that the conditions were in place for communities to respond well. Effective relationships, absolutely at the heart of making community empowerment work well, very open and transparent relationships. A relentless focus on improving outcomes. And again, you'll see in this report, a common thread throughout this report is a message about needing to have a clearer picture about what difference investment is making in a positive sense. And then finally, accountability, so that there was a sense of communities being able to hold public service to account. So these were all things that we recognised as really good in terms of community empowerment. You'll see examples sprinkled throughout this report where we've seen good examples, and what we want to see is that much more consistent approach that isn't just about surveying or focus groups, it's about communities being involved, hardwired in right at the start of any decisions that are being made that affect their communities. So as I say, you'll see that throughout the report as a strong message. It's something that Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission will continue to take a very keen interest in.
Thanks for that answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if there is no other questions, unless there are any final comments from the Auditor General?
Nothing to add from me. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, well, can I thank you, Auditor General, and your colleagues for your evidence this morning. I gather that this is Claire Sweeney's last meeting with us at the Audit Committee, so can I wish her all the very best in her next endeavour. And I'm sure we'll engage with you at Public Health Scotland at some point in the future. I now close the public part of this meeting as we move into private session.